Good day, everyone. My name is Dan Cosacchi, and I am coming to you from Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I am an assistant professor of religious studies and director of the Justice and Peace Studies program at Marywood University. I am very grateful today to be joined by a very distinguished panel, the members of which I will introduce momentarily. The panel today will address the topic, the Church after 2020, and we're very grateful to you for joining us. Today's webinar is made possible by Pax Romana ICMICA, which is a global community of Catholic intellectuals and professionals engaged in the world with a spirituality of action. For almost a century, this lay movement has facilitated dialogue and action among small Christian communities on concrete issues facing our world and our church. Over the past year, Pax Romana has launched a series of online dialogues at the national and continental levels on the future of the church, the future of democracy, and the future of education. Many of these can be viewed on the Pax Romana website. As we seek to revive our movement in the United States, we are sponsoring a series of conversations on key issues in a spirit of dialogue and with an eye toward action. Today's event is the first in a series of webinars on the Church after 2020. Stay tuned to social media in the coming days and weeks for information on the next installment of our series. I especially wish to thank Dr. Kevin Ahern, the president of Pax Romana, for his support in making today's event possible. Our format for today will be as follows. I will begin by posing a few general questions to our panelists, and each panelist will have a few moments to answer the question. After each panelist has gone, they may take the opportunity to engage with each other for a time. Meanwhile, I encourage you, our viewers, to pose your own questions for our panelists. If you are watching on the Zoom webinar, simply add your question to the Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you are following on Facebook Live, simply add a comment. While I can't promise to raise every single question in our Q&A, I will do my best in getting to as many as our time will allow. We will end our conversation today after 1 hour. Now, our panelists. Mr. Michael Bayer is currently, as he puts it, the Chicago-based Director of Catechetical and Ecclesiological Pyrotechnics on Twitter. He has served as campus minister at the University of San Francisco, University of Michigan, and University of Iowa, as a youth minister in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., as senior director for youth and young adults in the Diocese of Raleigh, and as Director of Evangelization and Adult Formation at St. Clement Parish in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He holds degrees in theology from Georgetown University and the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. Next is Bishop John Stowe. Bishop Stowe is the third Bishop of Lexington, serving in that office since May of 2015. He is a conventual Franciscan friar and served as a priest for 15 years in the Diocese of El Paso, as a pastor and as vicar general and moderator of the Curia. Following that, he was elected vicar provincial for his Franciscan province and became the rector of the Basilica and National Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio, until his appointment to Lexington. He studied philosophy and history at St. Louis University and received his MDiv and licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, now part of Santa Clara University. At the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, Bishop Stowe serves on the Administrative Committee, the Subcommittee for the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and the Subcommittee for Home Missions. He is also the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA and the Episcopal Liaison for the Catholic Committee of Appalachia. Dr. Shannon D Williams is the Albert LePage Assistant Professor of History at Villanova University. She is completing her first book, Subversive Habits: Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African-American Freedom Struggle, with Duke University Press. A public advocate for the teaching of Black Catholic history in every Catholic school, seminary, and religious formation program, Dr. Williams received the inaugural Sister Christine Schenck Award for Young Catholic Leadership from Future Church in the year 2018 for using history to foster racial justice and reconciliation in religious congregations of women. In 2020, she received the Mary Magdalene Award from the Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter of the Women's Ordination Conference for her efforts in recovering and amplifying the voices of Black Catholic women and girls in church history. I know if you were with us in person today, you would join me in providing a warm welcome for our panelists. So we'll jump right in with our first question. And in this question, Bishop Stowe will answer first, followed by Dr. Williams, and then Mr. Bayer will go third. So let's begin by discussing the new realities of COVID and its effect on worship and participation in the life of the church. How do you see the laity's involvement with the church once we have an effective vaccine in place? Do you see any areas where we can be strengthened by this experience of separation, or perhaps any long-term lingering negative effects? Bishop Stowe.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be with you this afternoon. We're all praying for that vaccine to happen soon, and we're all praying to get to some sort of new normal, whatever that might look like. And hopefully we're a better church because of it. One of the things I was really concerned about when we began going into a lockdown phase is that the church would be missing, that we wouldn't be found, that we wouldn't be noticed, that we wouldn't be active when people were no longer worshiping together, because it is the Eucharist that brings us together, and that's really at the heart of who we are as church. But I made the decision here, and I think it was the way for the future, even beyond COVID, is that we really have to focus on our social mission. I think charity and the works of justice are going to have to be the way forward. One of the ways we might even understand this COVID pandemic is a dress rehearsal, perhaps, for the effects of climate change. Because the COVID has brought out to us the importance of recognizing how we are really all in this together, but the resources that we have to face these kinds of challenges are not the same. The injustices were laid wide open in the ability of some people to work from home and other people not to work from home, for some people to have access to government benefits and other people not to have access. So the church has really had to put forward an advocacy, which I think we've slipped away from in the last several decades, and I hope we take a stronger role in that going forward, and that's the whole church. That's where the laity is just as important as the clergy, and even in our charity. You know, charity alone is not sufficient. It has to work with justice, but we've had to reach out, especially to our undocumented population and to people who are really hurt by this pandemic and didn't have other resources. I hope in our justice and our advocacy, it is opening us to the importance of moving up the care of creation as one of the core doctrines of our church and one of the pro-life issues for our Catholic faith. Caring for this planet, caring for this environment. And I think the church going forward is going to have to take that very seriously. Now, liturgically and prayerfully, in terms of our worship, I really hope what we learned from the pandemic was regaining an appreciation for the domestic church and in those families where people could gather around. Sometimes it was gathering around a live stream mass. Sometimes it was being creative and doing their own prayer services, but realizing that is where it begins. But then if we want that to be an effective model for organizing the church, we have to pay attention to the family, as Pope Francis did in the two synods of bishops. They focused on the family, and in Amoris Laetitia afterwards. It really does provide an opportunity for a more domestic central church. And then, you know, by taking away the obligation to attend Mass and then even the possibility to attend Mass, but at least in our case, the first step was taking away the obligation. Hopefully that's helping people make adult decisions for themselves instead of being told exactly what you have to do. You know, people hunger for the Eucharist, and that's a good thing, but sometimes they have to make the difficult choice. Can I be there, or should I go on a weekday instead of on the weekend when it's less crowded, or other kinds of things? And maybe another hope that I would see going forward is that we develop other ways of praying together that might be more conducive to prayer online, that we might rediscover the Psalms and scriptural prayer, liturgy of the hours, as so many of our brothers and sisters of other Christian denominations do as a regular form of worship. So I see lots of possibilities, and I see lots of hope But we need the formation to go along with that if it's going to make an impact on the church going forward.
Dr. Williams.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with everyone. I just want to reiterate what Bishop Stowe had said. The pandemic in so many ways has reminded us that there have always been multiple ways of being and doing church. And so when I think about what has happened, while we may not be attending daily mass or weekly mass, there are people who are out there every day running distribution centers for food, doing drive-by checkups on the most vulnerable members of their communities, who are doing grocery shopping or other essential shopping for people who cannot get out. And so it's been really interesting for me to sort of participate in prayer sessions via Zoom and to sort of think about how we do church and how other people have been doing church, even in sort of these other moments. And so there's a part of me, right, that is also excited about the possibilities if there is an opportunity to make some aspects of digital worship permanent. And I think about that for someone who is away from her home parish. It's given me the opportunity to reconnect with people. I've lived a lot of places, and so I've been able to reconnect with a lot of parishes that I've been a part of over the years. And also just paying attention to see how other people perform Catholic worship. I do a lot of research on Black Catholic nuns, and I've taken this opportunity to go and visit and participate in services and see other via Zoom parishes that produced a lot of Black vocations to religious life over the years, to sort of think about what that means to engage with other Catholics across the country, which has been so important for me. And I even think about the ways in which digital worship can even become a tool of evangelization. To think about if you are not in a community where homilies regularly address sort of the day-to-day realities of racism or working people, that you have this opportunity to see how Catholic worship is done in other spaces, to be able to bear witness to the variations of Catholic worship, and to be able to see, among many things, for what a lot of us don't get to see in some of our parishes, to see the Black saints on permanent display. What does it mean to see the Black Madonna, to see that and what that means for the church, but also to showcase to other people what it means to be Catholic is not singular, if that makes any sense, that you have this opportunity to really do some great outreach made possible by technology. And so for me, I'm actually someone who has looked at this and looked at the benefits, and I think that they're great. And certainly as we think about the need to be able to reach back to people, those who have left the church for a host of reasons, those who have been away for quite some time, who will, if you ask them, you push them to a wall, even if they don't go to mass every Sunday, but they will tell you that they're Catholic, right? That they have been missing something. And I wonder if this is a way to bring people back, especially if we can sort of highlight the great diversity of our experience and our worship experiences across the country. So I am certainly an advocate for at least keeping some level of this in terms of digital worship, keeping it an option for people, especially the homebound, those who become temporarily homebound as a result of illness or pregnancy. I think what has been really interesting for me is to see people who had children recently who said, you know, we never missed a day of mass because it was available to us via Zoom. And so I think that that's just something that, you know, local parishes and the church at large can think about in the ways in which this may actually bring a lot of people back to the church, or it has the potential to do so.
Thank you so much. Mr. Baer.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I echo everything that's just been said. I guess I'll take the piece you asked specifically about the role of the laity in all of this. And I think that one of the things that the pandemic has exposed for many people is that a lot of this is falling on Father right now, right? You know, clergy who went to seminary to study Eucharistic theology, the sacraments, and all of a sudden, all of that is taken away from them. So everyone's freaking out and trying out how to figure out to do live stream masses using cell phones, and everyone's asked to become a kind of low budget YouTube star overnight, right? And the liturgies are a little awkward. They're not incarnational. We can't reach out and hold each other. So it's not the Eucharist as we've experienced it. But I think that, you know, so much focus was put on live stream masses. And then the next question was, how are we going to keep the lights on? How are we going to get people into online giving? How are we going to reach out? There's been so much crisis response that I think that one of the things that's exposed is an unhealthy ecclesiological model that too much is on the priests, right? right? They're asked to be CEO, CFO, Chief Sacramental and Spiritual Officer. No one person can do all of those things. And so when you ask what is the pandemic really, kind of teaching us, I hope it's teaching us that we need the laity to be invited into their rightful baptismal role of co-responsibility for the leadership of the parish. Father can't possibly call every single elderly and homebound member who's not able to participate in live stream masses because they're not good with technology. So how are we setting up programs to form our own parishioners to do virtual ministries of care? How can those ministries of care continue well after the pandemic? All right, so now that we've got the live stream set up, we've got the video camera mounted, can we then during the weekday be thinking about, again, to the point earlier, can we be doing evening prayer and just saying to families, join us for evening prayer, or doing webinars and workshops heading into this new religious ed and Catholic school year, teaching parents how to pray the liturgy of the hours at home with the domestic church. Could you start your morning? We've all become a little bit monastic right now in some ways, right? And the Benedictines figured this out, right? Which is orient your day around what the tasks are that you have to get done and God. And the only other thing I want to say, because I could go on for a long time, is that I do want to say that experiences during the pandemic have been so varied, right? So I'm privileged in that for the majority of this, I was able to work from home. I was able to continue to have health insurance, things like that, whereas many of our brothers and sisters in this country, particularly disproportionately communities of color, undocumented immigrant communities, they never had that luxury. They never had the luxury of tuning in at 10 a.m. on Sunday for Zoom church because they were essential workers who were stocking grocery shelves. And the question is, are more affluent parishes, are we going to live that term in Catholic teaching, solidarity, coming out of this pandemic? Are we going to be in solidarity with each other, not just focused on how do we keep our own parishes solvent, which obviously is the primary concern of many pastors, but how do we look at the other communities in a city like Chicago, where I am, where we're going through parish reorganization, and saying, what do we owe to those disproportionately low income Black and brown communities whose workers never stop showing up for our takeout meals and grocery stores? Are we going to be the church coming out of this pandemic?
Great. Thank you very much. Before I ask if any of you, you three panelists, have any feedback from what you've heard, I do want to just remind everybody watching out there, again, thank you so much for joining us. On the bottom of the Zoom window is a Q&A option. Please submit your questions, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, please feel free to comment, and I'll be monitoring those throughout, and we'll get to that later on in our broadcast. Did any of you have any further comments based on a reaction to one of your fellow panelists? It's okay if not, but.
I think there was a lot of common ground, but I think the hungering for community as well as the hungering for Eucharist were almost equal. And maybe those were things we took for granted before the virus, and now we have a new stimulus to really value those things as we come out of it.
Right. Okay. Next question, and we'll start this time with Dr. Williams and then go to Mr. Bayer and finally finish up with Bishop Stowe on this question. In late May, George Floyd, as we all know, was brutally murdered by police officers in Minneapolis. Over the following days, weeks, and now months, countless instances of police brutality were brought to light through various forms of media, especially on social media. Now, of course, this new attention only refocused the nation on past instances of police brutality, as well as longstanding systemic racism in our country. Often enough, the church has failed to adequately respond to this racism. So how can we move forward now as church? What are some concrete things the church in the United States can do to confront racism effectively? Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Over the past few weeks, I have done a lot of public writing with regard to the need to atone, to confront and atone for the church's own direct complicity and agency in the contemporary crisis that we face as a nation as it relates to racial injustice and white supremacy. And I have been outlining what I think to be an adequate plan for reparations. And one of the first things that the church must do is to tell the truth about itself. It must make formal apologies. It must formally acknowledge the church's own role in the history of slavery and segregation, that the church was never an innocent bystander in this history, that the church was there at the beginning. So often when I teach the history of the transatlantic slave trade and I show images from Elmina Slave Castle, I always make a point to show the image of the chapel that is there, to understand that there was always a priest there at every turn. that this is not something that the church was just sitting idly by. It was completely engulfed in this system, that indeed it means something that the church itself was the first corporate slaveholder in the Americas, that somehow that history is unknown to so many of us, and yet it's everywhere around us. And so beyond making formal apologies and acknowledging this history, one must also begin to teach Black Catholic history, Black and Brown Catholic history, as I say, in every Catholic school, from the from kindergarten up until graduate school, in every seminary and every religious formation program. I cannot tell you how many times I've been emailed over the past several weeks from Catholics, Black and non-Black alike, who said, I have never been taught this history. I don't know this history. How is it possible that I don't know this history? And so that in itself tells us that one of the weapons, right, has been to erase this history, to suppress it. It's not an issue that it's not documented. It's documented everywhere, and yet it has not been taught. So that is absolutely key, not only apologizing, confronting, atoning, acknowledging, but also teaching it, making sure that we never forget this again. There should never be any Catholic who is sort of shocked by the reality that there are Black people who are Catholic. They're shocked by the reality that Black people's history in this country is older than most other people's history in this country, that they are here from the very beginning. If we're looking at Spanish Florida, if we're looking at South Carolina, if we're looking at California, and certainly as we move into Latin America. And so that's absolutely key for us. And then I also think that the church has to take leading roles in campaigns that are working to protect Black lives, that are working to dismantle white supremacy, whether it is in the healthcare system and sort of rooting out these biases that produce these gross inequities in terms of life outcomes, whether it is working to end mass incarceration and bail, whether it is meaning to sort of secure police reform and accountability, that the church has a responsibility. We have to begin to recognize that in the 15th century, with the passage of a series of papal bulls, the church declared that Black and brown lives did not matter. And so at some point, and I hope it is now, that the church will finally say, with all of its resources, with all of its rights, with all of its might, that Black and brown lives do matter. I think this is at the core of our problem of the crisis. And if the church cannot confront it now, at this particular moment, and if it cannot say Black lives matter, if it cannot say that brown lives matter, I'm not sure that, I don't know where we go from there. I'm also a practicing Catholic, so I believe that we have the possibilities to do it. But I think that is why we have to teach Black Catholic history and brown Catholic history, because the blueprint is in that history of those faithful who never had to be taught that it was wrong to enslave another person. Of those people who never had to be told that it was wrong to exclude someone because of the color of their skin, that understand that we have a tradition already of people who have been fighting this. And so if we look to that history, if we look to those people, to those faithful, then I think we have a shot.
Great. All right, Mr. Baer.
Oh, amen to everything Shannon said, and it's a joy to hear her articulate it. So parishes have a role in this, and white folks have a very important role, which is that the work of educating white folks around this history is not Shannon's job. By the way, read everything Shannon's writing. It is our job to educate ourselves. Read Brian Massengale's book, read Maurice Nutt's book about Thea Bowman, read Diane Batts-Morrow, read the work that's already out there instead of asking them to come educate us right now. My sisters and brothers of color have told me over and over again, those who've graced me with their honesty, I am so tired of being asked to come educate white folks about the realities of growing up and living in this country as a person of color. And it is time that our predominantly white parish communities in particular say, as a community, from the parish council, from the rafters, we commit to do the work, and it's going to be work. This is not just a book club. This is not a short-term speaker series. This is putting in the work of being in solidarity, learning and then atoning for reparations. Get people in your parishes comfortable with saying the word reparations. Make them say that word. Do not find substitutes for it, and then start asking, what would that look like? We got a lot of doctors in our community. Are there any healthcare deserts here? Look at the healthcare system. Look at the policies in our city, in our state, in our country. We have some lawyers lawyers here. We've got people in finance. We need to educate ourselves about how these systems, redlining, housing, environmental factors like where the meat packing plants are put and things like that. All those things, being Catholic should ruin your conscience all day long. And certainly parishes should be saying, if we're going to have a food contractor for an event, God willing, on the other side of this, are their workers paid a living wage? You know, are we trying to do everything we can? Because reparations isn't just saying, oh, do we have any Black folks in our congregation? Should we write them a check? It's a matter of dismantling the systems and the policies and the institutions, including within our own Catholic Church, that continue to benefit white folks disproportionately in this country. And it's everything that Shannon said, from mass incarceration to immigration to police brutality. And it really has to be white communities saying to their sisters and brothers, first of all, we're not asking anything of you in this moment. We're doing the work ourselves. And when you're ready, how can we come to you? How can we be in solidarity with you? And certainly there's going to be a lot of parish closures happening in the next 10, 20 years. There's going to be a lot of school closings, and those are disproportionately going to happen in Black and brown, low-income communities. Are wealthy white American Catholics going to see solidarity with those low-income Catholic schools in urban neighborhoods as one concrete step towards a small step towards reparations?
Bishop Stowe.
Michael, I suspect you are correct that people of color are tired of having to tell their story over again, and I'm sure Dr. Williams has had that experience, but I also know the importance of we in the white community needing to listen, and reading is probably a safe way to do it, but we really need to hear those stories, as difficult as they are to tell, because it's nothing except those stories that really engage us. It's not just talking about concepts here, but talking about human lives and human people who continue to live the burdens of the kind of white supremacy that has been so dominant in our country. Where I live, and I'm sure it's not that different in other places, but in Kentucky, it's very hard to say those words without getting a reaction. And it's always been my concern, how do I talk about white privilege to unemployed coal miners in Appalachia? And you know, Father Brian Massengill has been a real tutor for me and a spiritual director, in a sense, in my ongoing conversion regarding racism, because he said, why is it only white people whose comfort you're worried about? Mm-hmm. And it was important to hear those words. It was important to be reminded that it is an uncomfortable topic for everybody involved, but nobody suffered like the African-American community when it comes to slavery, and nobody suffers like people of color when it comes to the white normative narrative in our society and sadly in our church. Yeah, Dr. Williams said that it surprises some people that there are Black Catholics. Well, when we look at Africa, it's the majority part of the growing church. You know, we're the ones that are diminishing. It's white Catholics that are disappearing in this country. We look at the age of our Latino brothers and sisters and see where the future of the church is. It's not with us. But in response, I think what is so important, in addition to what has been said, and I agree with those points very much, I think it's really an examination of conscience. You know, it's easy for us to say that was my ancestors that were involved in this, and that was another generation, and why should we be involved in reparation? But if we do a sincere examination of conscience, we have to recognize how those of us who are white benefit from white privilege, even if we don't want to acknowledge it or admit it. It's real for us, just as it's real for those who are oppressed by it. And I think the overarching issue is, for too long and in too much of our church, the social teaching is seen as icing on the cake or something optional or something extra. It's not seen as part of orthodoxy. Well, there should be no difference between the orthodox presentation of the faith and the inclusion of Catholic social teaching, which just begins with the dignity of the human person. And God knows in our history we've gotten it wrong. Even if the teaching was right, we got it wrong more often than not in practice. But we need to keep working on it. We need to keep talking about it, and we can't just back away when it's uncomfortable.
Great. We are getting some great questions, everybody, from you, the viewers. So I think right now I'm going to step away from my questions and turn to some of yours so we have ample time to cover them. And there are a lot of topics being covered. One sort of overarching theme that I'm seeing in these questions is how will people who have been negatively affected by the church respond? What standing does the church have? So does the church have any legs to stand on? So here's a question from one of our viewers. He writes, "It is my deep hope right now that the church will begin to more adequately engage in the racial justice movement, as Dr. Williams is saying. But many Catholics seem opposed to this movement out of a fear of working alongside movements like Black Lives Matter, which also fight to end the oppression of LGBTQ people. Is there any chance in your mind that the church can be taken seriously in the racial justice movement while continuing to have teachings and practices regarding LGBTQ people and women that most members of the racial justice movement do not hold? Do you think the church could learn something from Black Lives Matter and these movements? Thank you." So anybody who wants to take a stab at that, there's definitely a lot of linking between issues here.
I find myself repeating rather frequently that Black Lives Matter is not a monolithic movement, and that everybody who has a BLM sign that is marching in the street is not part of a foundation that has trademarked that phrase for themselves. And it's not, I think it's important that Catholics who are not people of color are able to say Black Lives Matter, and it's critical that we are able to say that we have to be converted, that we have to change our hearts and minds and ways of thinking to be able to embrace that. But I think there's a lot we can learn from the various movements that are out there.
I think for those who are uncomfortable with saying the three words, Black Lives Matter, if that in any way makes anyone uncomfortable, I guess I don't know how to respond to that as someone. If all lives matter, then Black Lives Matter. That's just a simple reality. So for me, I'll put it this way. My entire being over the last 13 years has been rooted in trying to help every Catholic to understand that Black history is Catholic history and that Catholic history is Black history. Like, if you are uneasy about saying Black Lives Matter, how would you be, how would you feel about sort of that, saying that to someone like Servant of God, Mary Lang, or Venerable Henriette DeLille, right? To these individuals who are literally living in a society in which people that looked like them were enslaved by their own church, but who still saw within the church that was wrong, that the most important teaching for me is that in the value and the sanctity of all human life. And those women and men who lived in those spaces and in those times still saw something within Catholic social teaching that they would not turn away, that they said, we will never surrender our church to the forces of evil and white supremacy and slavery that are doing. And that for me, for any Catholic who is uneasy about sort of this particular movement, it's also important to remember that the church was also very uneasy about the civil rights movement, right? The Catholic Church was the last of the 17 major denominations to endorse the Brown decision, that the Vatican was telling them to do it, and they still refused to do so. They waited until 1958. And so this is not unusual in Catholic teaching. What I'm saying, though, is that those bishops who may have been hesitant to endorse the Brown decision were not all of Catholics, right? They may have been reflective of the significant part of the sort of the white Catholic community, but there were also Black Catholics who were like, nope, you know, we understand where we are, that we are the moral compass of this church. We will drag our church to the right side of history if we can. And I think that sort of has to be the way in which we approach this contemporary moment as well. That if we cannot be courageous, and saying Black Lives Matter is actually the very least that you can do, right? There are ways to say and to be about Black Lives Matter, even if you're uncomfortable saying those terms, right? That you can be out there. If you march for and participate in the March for Life, go out there and march in Flint for clean water. Like, go out there and stop when we see people who are being abused. Stop. Call for better resources for our school system. Do not let a parish be closed and you have an opportunity to sort of step in and engage. There are ways to say and do Black Lives Matter if you are very uneasy about potentially sort of one organization. But I think I also just say that we all have to be courageous in this moment if we are all going to survive. And I think the better way to think about it is, look at what the church lost when it denied Black vocations to religious life. Look at what the church has lost when it has practiced racial segregation and said that, oh, you know, that Black lives didn't matter. That the church finds itself in the position that it is in right now because it had said that those vocations did not matter, that those lives did not matter, that their dreams did not matter, that Black Catholic education didn't matter. And we know that those things absolutely mattered. And so where would we be now if the church had said that those things mattered? I'm gonna stop, but because I want Michael to have some time, but yes.
Yeah, well, amen to everything that's been said. One of the things I'd say is it's so fascinating which particular topics we allow fear to be the driving factor in, right? So I've never heard, I shouldn't say never, I've rarely heard a young priest say, I'm just so fearful that if I speak out on contraception or same-sex marriage or abortion, that I'm going to turn off so many of my congregation. Why is it that when it comes to children in ICE cages and police murders of Black unarmed teenagers that we're suddenly afraid that we might offend people? And again, who are we afraid of offending by saying the phrase Black Lives Matter, which they do? And so the other thing is, I'll hear people say, oh, well, you know, this movement, it's Marxist, it's this. So first of all, those are the exact same tired, boring things they said about Martin Luther King when 3/4 of American Catholics opposed the civil rights movement, when it was white Catholics in Chicago writing hate mail to the Archbishop of Chicago for his public support of Dr. King in the 60s. This is not the 1500s. This is the 1960s. People still alive in our parishes. So we like to think we were on the right side of it, but I think part of learning that history Shannon is talking about is we really weren't, not the majority of us. And right now we need to be on the right side of this. And one of the things that I hear people saying is, oh, it's associated with all these other things. Excuse me. I have heard so many white Catholic friends when I say, well, how can you support the Trump administration? How can you support, you know, immigration? And they go, well, I don't agree with everything that he does. I'm sorry, what? So you're allowed to use well, I don't agree with the whole platform when it comes to a particular person you agree with about abortion because you're hoping for a Supreme Court nomination, but then all of a sudden that's a disqualifying factor for supporting a movement, and it's not an organization. I've heard people say, oh, it's a Soros, but stop it. It's a grassroots movement, and it's closer to any of the lay or grassroots movements in our church, honestly, than institutional, whether it was renewal of the Desert Fathers or the Franciscans and stuff. The renewal always comes from the ground up, and Black Lives Matter has sprouted from the ground up. So it's harder to find institutionally. But one thing I will issue as kind of a challenge is, and I'm so grateful Bishop Stowe is here, and this is not intended to be towards him personally, but where our hierarchy on this? Why aren't we planning a 1 million person march in Washington, D.C. for immigrants? Why weren't we doing that when all of this started? Why are we waiting? Why aren't we planning a march for Black lives through the streets of Washington, D.C. and use the same listservs, invite all the same people who buy buses to go to D.C. every January? I've been in those marches protesting, the assault on preborn life. Where are our mass Washington, D.C. show up and protest the assault of Black and brown life?
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists there for answering that wonderful question. And each of you touched on things both in that answer and in your previous answer that gives us a lot of food for thought going forward. So just a few items off the top of my head. Where is the preaching and teaching on Catholic social doctrine? We had one question that addressed all the speakers. It first of all thanked Bishop Stowe for mentioning the climate crisis, and then asked, why is the American Church so hesitant to implement the extraordinary vision of Pope Francis in Laudato Si? So there's that. There's also the credibility question of the U.S. Catholic bishops. One person was very forthright in his question. Why does there seem to be such tone deafness and resistance among so many bishops to Black Lives Matter? Is the USCCB capable of exercising leadership on this issue? And again, we're not pointing right to Bishop Stowe here. This is a question for all the panelists. What recommendations might you have for the conference? And then a third question that maybe sort of ties a bow on this, because it also has to do with the credibility of the church, and it really is a personal question. As a single senior laywoman hearing about the domestic church focusing almost exclusively on family, where do I find my place in the church of 2020 and beyond? I believe in lifelong formation, but outside of a few friends, am made not to feel that my presence and input is valued. I join with those otherwise on the fringes of church. I believe that all of the issues derive from a common core of valuing all persons as the beloved of God, brothers and sisters. I want to be part of that dialogue. So I think this has to do with the credibility of the church, and it's not just the hierarchy, it's not just clergy, as Michael mentioned earlier, but I think that the clergy need to take this to heart. So your thoughts on any or all or other of topics that might tangentially relate to that credibility of the church? Anybody?
I mean, I think one of the things is that, you know, right now the church is asking these questions. How do we re-engage young people? How do we, you know, do we learn something from Jordan Peterson? Are we supposed to become Willow Creek? Are we supposed to be hiring MBAs left and right? What do young people want? And the fact of the matter is, young people are hungry for the kerygma, and the kerygma necessarily involves the Catholic social doctrine. You can't do Jesus without also doing work for justice. It's again, the cherry on top, or the icing, the extra. That's what some people think. The work for racial justice in this moment, the work for authentic economic justice in this moment, for expanding healthcare, that is what's going to bring people back in. And in doing so, it will reestablish our credibility as a moral voice worth listening to. Part of the reason we have a credibility issue is that we you know, to be blunt, in too many chanceries, the huddles are with the lawyers, the consultants, the PR people, and the HR people before we ever get to a single young person from the flock. And so how we reestablish credibility with people is we do our own teachings that we have failed to implement. And we've done a lot of things really well. So I don't want to seem that it's all gloom and doom. We've done a lot of things really well, but the young people see, and I will circle back to that thing previously, they do see the church's harmful and often dehumanizing language around LGBTQ plus individuals. They see that, and that is such a huge credibility issue for us. They see young, articulate women who have a voice, and they say, why aren't their voices amplified? Why can't they preach? We're in the middle of Zoom everything. We're in the middle. Why are the only videos that are being posted on parish Facebook pages videos of priests? Are there no women in the parishes that have something to say? So I think that the credibility will be reestablished when we start doing what our own documents say we're supposed to be doing.
I can't disagree with anything that Michael said. And in fact, I'd like to have his help in answering some of my mail, especially when it comes to the critique of Black Lives Matter. But I also share in the critique of the bishops as a whole. I don't think we've been prophetic. I don't think we have stood for the things that we need to stand for. We've come through a period of time where the church has been very inward looking, and Pope Francis is telling us to get out of that confinement, that we're suffocating ourselves, and we have to go to the periphery, we have to go to the margins, and the margins are screaming for it right now. And I think that was made very clear in the pandemic, and will continue to be made clear as we face the consequences of climate change. I'm touched by the concern from the single woman and feeling that, you know, even the talk about domestic church can be exclusive or feel exclusive of some people. And so I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer for that, although I do know of places where people are forming their own small communities that are life-giving, and our understanding of family has to change. We have to be in a different understanding of family, and that's where the LGBT issues come into play. I agree completely with Michael that our credibility is on the line with the whole generation and more of young people who just don't buy that teaching and know from their experience and know from the people that they know that there are good and loving people that happen to identify as LGBT, and it's part of who they are. So another burden that I've carried is a lot of criticism from those in the church for trying to reach out to that population in the church, but they're beloved by God. They're part of the family. They share in the dignity that everyone else shares, and we have to acknowledge it across the board. So keep raising your voices, keep flooding our mailboxes as bishops, keep letting us hear that, you know, there is a sensus fidei, that there's the sense of the faithful that also has to be part of church teaching. And so Pope Francis has said it repeatedly, bishops have to listen as much as they teach, and you can't be a good teacher if you're not a good listener, and you can't be a good teacher if you're not a good student. So the teaching church and the listening church have to be one and the same.
Absolutely. I probably don't have that much to add beyond the fact that whatever we do forward has to be sort of driven by the truth and a desire to make sure that that truth is reflected in everything that the church does. I mean, I even think about it in terms of, you know, when I go to New Orleans and I go and see the old Ursuline convent, and, you know, everyone goes to sort of see that at some point, like, I wonder how many people sort of look at that institution and say, you know what, it's slave built. Does anyone recognize that? That it was slave built, that so many places in the Catholic Holy Land are slave built, that so much of the early church is slave built. There is no recognition of that whatsoever. What would it mean if the Archbishop of Louisville, for example, went to St. Augustine Cemetery in Lebanon, Kentucky, went into that very segregated, it's literally a segregated cemetery. Most of the enslaved people and their descendants who built much of the Catholic Holy Land are buried in that cemetery, most of them in unmarked graves. Some of them are. Some of those families, owned by the Spaldings and other sort of prominent Catholic families, sent their children into religious life. They built these monasteries and convents all in the Kentucky, in the Catholic, the Holy Land in Kentucky, and they had to go outside of Kentucky because no community would accept them. What does that mean if there are recognitions of that? And the Pius Smiths and Mary Eliza Smiths, who are in and buried at St. Augustine Cemetery, that family themselves are responsible for more than 15 vocations to religious life. What would it mean if we begin to sort of recognize that history? When we talk about not simply formally acknowledging in this history and apologizing for it, making sure that we institutionalize this history. Like, you have to be about it, right? It's not just simply we apologize, we sort of acknowledged it. Acknowledgement means, okay, when we go to the Ursuline convent, there is marking and information everywhere saying this is slave built. What does that mean for us, and how are we beginning to sort of confront that reality? I think that has to be sort of how we move forward, whether it is with sort of issues around racial justice, whether it is issues around LGBTQ life, and anything else. It has to be honest, it has to be truthful. And I think young people respond to that. Not that people are perfect, but rather that when they make the mistake, they acknowledge the mistake and atone for it. We do not have a good history of saying that we're sorry. We do not have a history of saying that this is what we did and it was absolutely wrong. So whatever it may be in terms of the issue, that's where we have to move forward, or at least from my perspective.
And Dan, can I just add two quick things? I promise I'll keep it. Number one is that I think the resources for that, I keep thinking, I thank Bishop Stowe for reminding us of the woman who asked, where is my place? And, you know, I think this, to me, and I don't want to presume what her background is, but so much of what I have seen, especially in a lot of white, fairly middle class, upper middle class Catholic communities, is that we have been more infected by the American individualism and egocentrism of this culture than we have witnessed to a prophetic, radical, common good collectivism of the gospel. And that's something I have experienced when I have gotten to spend time in Mexican, Vietnamese, Nigerian predominant communities. Is there is no one who's going to be left behind like that. They're not going to let that happen. So many of the churches in the global south would never think to allow someone to find themselves. And so this is where we're not looking outside for answers. We need to be looking inside our church, which is authentically a church in the United States, certainly an immigrant-built church, but it's a global church. It's not just the wealthy white parish in the western suburbs. It is a church that is fundamentally diverse. And also, the second point is we need to link it to our sacraments and prayer, right? We have a woman whose son was murdered unjustly by the state, and that's Mary, by the way. We have a woman who fled across international borders to keep her child safe from violence. That's Mary, by the way. Can we teach our kids how to pray the rosary, and at the beginning of each Hail Mary, remember the name of George Floyd or Eric Garner or Breonna Taylor? Can we link our Blessed Mother and prayers for her with advocacy around these issues? I think we can.
Great. There are so many questions in there, everybody. Thank you so much for all of them. A number of people have asked about resources for books and parishes, especially resources along racial justice. Once this is over, we're going to archive this this broadcast, and there are a number of very good syllabi and reading lists for sources like this. So we will include those links in there, so you have a very exhaustive list to peruse. A few people have asked about this. We have an election coming up 3 months from Monday. I don't know if anybody knew that, but it's happening. And
I heard it might be delayed.
Well, right. That's a whole nother matter. This isn't a constitutional webinar. A number of questions here on the support for President Trump from clergy or the hierarchy. So let me just read a couple of them. One comes from Facebook. What are your thoughts on the increasing rhetoric from some American Catholic clergy and networks that a Catholic vote must necessarily align with the Republican Party? A second questioner writes from Canada. And the questioner says that we are shocked, as Canadians are shocked and disbelieving at the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States endorsing Mr. Trump. Now, clearly not every bishop has done that, but some have come either pretty close, or at least in 2016, 2 bishops put bulletin inserts in all the bulletins in their dioceses, reminding Catholics that any vote by a Catholic could not be for someone who supported abortion rights. So clearly there is a parallel between saying that and supporting one particular candidate. So I wonder what our panelists have to say as we look toward the election and the Catholic relationship to that election.
I'm going to start again, but you know, Pope Francis has given us a great definition of what pro-life means. And he basically tells us we can't claim to be pro-life if we support the separation of children from their parents at the US border, if we support exposing people at the border to COVID-19 because of the facilities that we're in, if we support denying people who have need to adequate health care, access to that health care, if we keep people from getting the housing or the education that they need, we cannot call ourselves pro-life. So yes, we have to be concerned for the unborn children. It's foundational for us, but it's all connected. Our understanding of pro-life has to be the vision that that was described as the seamless garment vision some years ago. And for this president to call himself pro-life, and for anybody to back him because of claims of being pro-life, it is almost willful ignorance. He is so much anti-life because he's only concerned about himself, and he gives us every indication of that. So I really have a hard time with that line of thinking, but I've had people tell me on a regular basis, it doesn't matter, it's all about abortion. And when the US bishop snuck that into the document about forming consciences for faithful citizenship at the last minute and refused Cardinal Supich's amendment to include the paragraph from Gaudete et Exsultate from Pope Francis about what the real pro-life issues are, the totality of pro-life issues, that was a sad day for the leadership of the Church in the United States.
And it should be noted, just for the record, Bishop Stowe, that you did raise a point on the floor that people would read the document and interpret it this way. So you were prophetic, unfortunately, as it was, because the document was published that way. But you were prophetic in that sense. Dr. Williams or Mr. Baer, please.
Question we always have to ask ourselves and continue to ask ourselves is which Catholics? Which Catholics, which Catholics, which Catholics, and particularly in terms of who is using sort of the Catholic identity to erase and misrepresent and use it as a way to exclude and to criminalize and everything else as well. I guess I think at some point we have to be very, very honest about exactly who we're talking about when we say who would interpret it in that way, because I'm looking at certainly Black Catholic women, Black Catholic youth, and most Black Catholic men who were very uneasy about sort of the 2016 election. We have to be very honest. No person is ever just simply Catholic. That so much of our identity, and whether it is whiteness, whether it is our Blackness, or whatever it is, that we are it is always guiding our conversations. And so if we don't begin to have an understanding about intersectional intersectional identities within Catholic faithful, then we're not being very honest about this conversation, because I feel like we're still not saying which Catholics, which Catholics, which Catholics, because at some point, the church is going to have to confront with those individuals who voted for our current president in 2016. And it wasn't just members of the laity, right? They were religious, not simply priests, but also sisters. And I heard from a lot of Black Catholic sisters who are members of white religious communities, and their entire communities were voted for our current president in 2016. And that is a truth that if anyone is shocked by that, that means you have no understanding of the history of this country and the role of racism and the role of white supremacy within formation of religious life, and in the ways in which it has manifested itself in the history of this church. If that is a shock to anyone, then I say you have no understanding of what it is meant to be Black and Catholic in this country, to be a person of color and Catholic in this country. And so we have to be very honest. When we say Catholic, be specific about who we mean, and what is going on in these kinds of situations.
Amen. A couple things. One, thank you, both of you. One is, I see the social media posts from some prominent Catholic clergy and white Catholics and I think to myself, I cannot imagine being a person of color and walking into church on Sunday, knowing that that person is in charge of spiritual care of souls in this parish. That is one thing. I think the pastoral harm that is being done by certain people who are very vocally and publicly endorsing a very anti-life president. And I'm not saying that means that the alternative is obvious. I'm saying that whatever else is true, this is, as Bishop So said, someone who is not pro-life. And so that's one thing, is I just think of, if I'm a priest right now, if I'm a seminarian, every single public statement I make, I'm running through the lens of how are the poor, the marginalized, the persons of color, people who've been victims of systemic racism and oppression, how are they going to hear that statement that I'm making, not from the pulpit, but from my Twitter handle or my Facebook page, or things. So that's number one, is that discernment. Number two is that I'll say what I think a lot of people can't say, which is that I think that there are many bishops who, because they've huddled for so long around lawsuits and their fears, lawsuits are driving so much right now. State legislatures are looking what happened in New York with the 1-year moratorium on the statute of limitations. And everyone's going, oh my God, what if that happens here? And the cascade of lawsuits comes, and everybody's looking at bankruptcy and how do we survive? And so who you huddle with are the lawyers and the PR people, and so it becomes very easy to be in this combative, litigious, kind of sort of mindset all the time. And one of the things is, I think there are bishops that genuinely believe they are being very politically savvy by trying to play the president or other leading politicians in exchange for some favors, whether it's influence over judicial appointments or whether it's funding in a stimulus package for Catholic schools that really are facing existential crisis. I think there are people who think that if they stay silent on some issues and boost the signal on school vouchers and religious liberty, that they will get a tit for tat that will benefit the church somehow, that will benefit the diocese somehow. And I think that is a very, very short-sighted Faustian bargain that really damages the credibility of us. And it centers our institutional, political, short-term exigencies over the gospel and Catholic doctrine. And that terrifies me. And that's where I think that we can't wait around for, the USCCB or whomever to put out the right statement on these things. That's where I think lay Catholics need to feel empowered and emboldened to use their own voices on this.
Right. Great. Thank you all so much. In the chat box on the side, there are some great comments. There are some more great questions and comments in the Q&A, and a lot of great praise for our three panelists. So I want to say that I wholeheartily agree with everybody's kind comments to the panelists. A reminder to everybody before I finish up with our final thought from each of our panelists. A reminder to everybody, this is only the first in a series from Pax Romana ICMICA. In the coming days, we're going to have an announcement about the next installment of our series with the next group of panelists. So there are so many great questions there. What I'm going to do is archive them and build them into questions that that will be asked in the next installment of this series. So I thank you so much for adding those questions and comments. And again, we'll be back to you with further information about when that next event will take place. If I could just close with a final thought from each of the panelists, and it's this question. Over the last hour, we've been talking, and at times I think we've been very critical, and at some points it may have even seemed like we've been negative about the direction of the church. Not at all points. There've been very very hopeful points also. But I want to end on this note. This question: what gives you hope for the church after 2020? What's one hopeful thing we can see in the church moving forward? Anybody can jump in.
I myself am greatly encouraged by Catholic educators who have been reaching out to me, the National Catholic Educational Association that is doing everything in their power to figure out what they need to do to build curriculums around, curricula around Black Catholic history. And that in itself is the most encouraging thing that I see at this particular moment, because Black Catholic history calls us to action. You cannot know the stories of Black Catholics in this country and not be moved to action, not be called to sort of demand justice and demand change, to demand reparations in our nation and in this and in our church. And so if we are moving towards a place where Black Catholic history is mandated in Catholic education, then we are definitely moving in the right steps. And certainly if everyone can say Black history is Catholic history, then I feel like we have done our jobs, that I have made Father Cyprian Davis very proud in carrying on his tradition. And so I'm happy, or hopeful.
I'll let the bishop have the last word. So I would say, for me, it's the people. It's the body of Christ incarnate in the people that I get to meet. It's Shannon and all the work she's doing. It's Bishop Stowe taking time. It's Sister Thea Bowman. It's that prophetic message in 1989 that everyone should go to YouTube right now and watch when this ends. It's that for every Sister Thea, there's millions of unnamed people like that. I get to meet so many of them. There's a young woman on Monday of this week, I met with Vanessa Zuleta Goldberg down in the Diocese of Las Cruces. Awesome young woman working for justice down there. It's all the people at Hope Border Institute. It's Sister Norma Pimentel. It's Sister Mary MacKillop, Saint Mary MacKillop in Australia, who when she was told no, she defied, and now she's canonized. So I guess what I'm saying, it's the women. It's the women who ran to the tomb, and even when Peter said, we got to see for ourselves, they sighed and they stuck with it. And for me, particularly in this moment in the United States of America, I have to say, if women of color haven't walked away from this, then what right do I have? And that gives me an amazing amount of hope.
Well, it's hard to top those lists of great people that are inspiring and give us hope. I would add to the list of women, those who work for Network, those who are, really showing us how to integrate Catholic social teaching in public policy, those who are working for nuclear disarmament, those who are recognizing that we have one planet and we've got to get this right. So it is the people at the grassroots that's been said over and over again. And I just have to add on to exactly what Michael said and what Dr. Williams has said about these religious women and the African-American Catholics. When we had a rally at St. Peter Claver in my diocese not too long ago, it just struck me being there that this was created for people who were excluded from other parishes, yet who are nothing but welcoming to anybody who comes in those doors. And I think that powerful witness continues to be a sign of hope for me. And whenever I worship there, it is so much to be at home and to really experience the praise of God at every level of my being. So there are people on the fields. Our immigrant community gives me hope every day. They live in fear. They're hiding from the law. They're worried about what their kids are going to be able to do or not be able to do. They're insulted on a regular basis and put down and excluded. And they smile and they pray and they sing, and they are people of hope and joy. So solidarity, there's that word again, Michael, solidarity.
Well, thank you all so much. There is a lot to be hopeful about. And judging from the participation we got today from so many viewers, your great questions and comments, that's a source of hope. Our three panelists are great sources of hope for me. And I think now for many of them as well. So I thank you all so much for joining us. And I especially thank our three panelists and Dr. Kevin Ahern with Pax Romana for hosting this discussion. Thanks so much, and we'll be in touch about our next installment of this series. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Good to be with you,
Take care.
all of you.